Hello and welcome to FTD Talk. My name is John James and I am a writer and campaigner for male victims of female perpetrated domestic violence. Many people come on the show from many different backgrounds, each with their unique story of domestic violence. Today we talk to David, autistic, suffering from PTSD, telling his story of his abusive relationship. It is a sad, horrific story, but with hope. I hope you find it interesting. Okay, David, welcome to FTD Talk.
Good afternoon.
Thank you very much for speaking to me today. I know it's very difficult for you, and it's a brave step to take, not only to speak to me, but speak to me on camera.
Yeah, thank you, man. You're right. It is hard. It's not a very well discussed area, so and it's not easy for men to come out and talk about these things, especially given the backlash that you get usually. So yeah, thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk about this.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay.
I'd like to begin with telling me a little bit about you. Who is David?
Okay, well, I was born on Anglesey, or Innismon, as it's known locally. My old man, my father was in the RAF, and not long after I was born there with one of my other brothers, we moved out to Germany. Spent the next sort of 12 to 13 years on and off in Germany. We had active service units of the IRA out there trying to bomb all our families, and it could be quite challenging at times growing up in those environments, but yeah, it was great. That led to me joining the forces 99, where I ended up in Kosovo twice, did 2 tours out there, one in Oman, one in Norway, attached to the Royal Marines. Came home, struggled with my mental health a little bit, managed to blag my way back into the army, ended up as household cavalry, and that was pretty much me. I was a military man for the first 32 years of my life until I came out. So now I'm in university. I had obviously a quite a bad relationship at one point. And the more I researched about what I was going through at the time, the more I was horrified by how many people were struggling, and the severity of the situation as well. So eventually I started obsessively researching, as you can expect from somebody who's partially autistic, and I've not stopped since sort of 2014. So I'm just completing my 3rd year at uni. I've had to take a year off because I've been sort of overworking myself. It's not been too good for my mental health. But in the meantime, I am writing my dissertation, which is a study of 728 male victims of domestic violence. So it's going to be one of the largest studies of its kind here in the UK. And that's pretty much me. That's all I do now. So I've gone from one fight to another. And yeah, that's what I do.
And can we go right back to the beginning of your relationship? How did you meet your abuser?
In work, actually. She stood out to me. It was one of these jobs. It was a sales job. One of these jobs where you could go in and get away with the bare minimum, and most did. I've never been that type. I work and I work hard. I get the job done, and so I just got on with it while everyone else sort of lazed about and did nothing. And she came in one day and she couldn't sit about either. She was as hardworking as I was, and she was good at her job. So yeah, we got chatting and things moved fast.
What was it like in the beginning?
It was amazing in the beginning. Just love through the roof. But it wasn't long before the cracks started in the relationship. The first one was about 3 It's been 3 months into the relationship. I went to the toilet, and when I came back, I caught her going through my phone. So I very sort of calmly sat down and said, what's going on? What are you worried about? And she explained that she said, both of my exes had cheated on me, and I'm just worried, that's all. Anyway, it immediately had this side of me thinking, oh God, the poor girl, I've never seen her do anything like this before. She must have gone through hell with these other people, and I resigned myself. Well, I'll be that guy that shows her that not all blokes are like this. I'll love her the way they didn't, and she'll never have to worry about this type of stuff again. She also told me the next day that one of her exes was incredibly violent, but he was so incredibly violent that when him and her split up, his mum chose her over him, which is just a crazy way of basically saying, this is what I do when I split up with my exes. I manipulate the world around me, and I will take everything dear from you. And that's certainly what happened over the next few years.
And when did it escalate? When did you eventually think, because at the moment you're being very sympathetic with her, when did you think something's not quite right here?
I can't actually explain the situation. I'm restricted by certain laws and things about what I can and can't discuss. So talking from a third-party perspective in terms of the research that I do, families have real problems when there's domestic violence, especially when the man is the victim. So there can be all sorts going on in the background involving the families that will bring up all sorts of worries in the father. But in my own case, what you tend to do is you tend to find excuses. Oh no, they didn't mean that, and they were they're stressed. You've just had children. This is the hard part. This is the beginning. 300 nappies a day type issue. And you just keep finding excuses. I'd love to be able to say the first time she really went for me physically at about 6 months, but that I was aware something else was going on, and I think that's true for a lot of blokes. I think this argument that blokes don't realise they're in domestic violence relationships is a very valid one. I didn't do it for a long time, and it took for other people to point it out to me. But I think in most of these relationships, and I'm definitely seeing this through my research, people are aware from very early on that something's not right, and it's just for some reason we don't sort that out when the issue comes up. We let it go on and on, especially given that female perpetrated violence can be such grey areas as well. When you're talking about coercive and controlling behaviours, they will manipulate all sorts of different situations and scenarios, Kafka traps, all that type of thing. And so to be able to put your finger on it as well is a big ask. I think it's something that you learn when you go back years later and look back on it. You realise, right, well, that was probably the biggest moment I had to go, do you know what? That should have been the time, or now should be the time,
And did you tell anybody about your concerns?
I was screaming to the world for help. All I could see was my wife suffering, and I was scared for her, petrified for her, and I was desperate to fix the situation. I never imagined myself to be that guy who got married and then divorced. I grew up in a very traditional family environment in the armed forces. Everyone had their roles to play, and mums were as dedicated as our fathers were. So we had big shoes to fill in terms of how relationships are managed. I put way too much pressure on myself to be the guy that was going to fix the issues that were there. And I think, obviously that is true for a lot of people in Civvy Street as well. But I had this overwhelming sense of duty on my shoulders from a time in the forces. Like, no, I've got to sort this out. I've gone from being one of the best soldiers in the world to, this scenario. There, clearly I can do this. I can fix this. But the more you're trying to fix, the more out the window it goes. Yeah.
But you're still talking about her being broken. You're still
Yeah.
talking about there's something wrong rather than her being abusive. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, yeah. I still do to this day. I can't say that her behaviour wasn't deliberate, wasn't extremely vicious, both physically and mentally. But having done all the research I have now into what the dynamics are that in the lead up to these types of relationships, I can't generally anymore say, well, that person is definitely an evil person and that person is definitely a perpetrator, or because there's so much that brings about these situations from people's childhood. I'm a prime example. I had a fairly rough childhood despite growing up in the forces. And that has affected my mental health in adult life, as you would expect from any member of the public. And when you look into the classifications that these perpetrators and victims fit into in this area, you very quickly realise, well, these are all just broken people, and these are all people trying to communicate a certain way and just not getting it. When you look at the data that's come out of Australia, Canada, Norway, we've got the Nordic paradox now. The behaviours that usually prompt these domestic violence situations are very much rooted in psychology, in terms of painful psychology, in terms of these people may have grown up bullied and don't know how to express themselves to the rest of the world beyond that bullying scenario. And yeah, you've also got the other flip of the coin where you've got lots and lots and lots of people having probably traumatic brain injuries. We know that 95% of the adult criminal population has come from a broken home. 82% of the youth justice system, the children in there, have come from a broken home. And when you look at the types of behaviours that are adopted by men and women in terms of the adaptation to those scenarios, you realise very quickly that there is an impulsive behavioural problem going on in terms of their choosing. They're acting on jealousy, for instance. Revenge seeking is one of the big indicators for a domestic violence event. That came out of Hume, Morgan and Boxall out of Australia a couple of years ago. And when you consider the types of violence that are committed by female perpetrators versus male perpetrators, you see a lot more revenge-seeking behaviour for what may be perceived emotional harm coming from women. He did this or he didn't do this, and that means he doesn't love me, and rah rah rah. Here comes the finger.
I think you've been very, very generous, David, because you yourself have had mental health issues. I myself didn't have a great upbringing, but that doesn't turn us into an abuser.
No, of course, you are choosing to at that point. And the problem for me is that I do see it as intergenerational trauma. So I don't. It's that saying in the Bible: we pay for the sins of our fathers. And when you look at things like adverse childhood experience checklists and things like that, you realise we are just dealing with broken people all the way back through history. But the fact that it is intergenerational means that there must be an opportunity at some point for an intervention, for a successful intervention, to undo a lot of that. And I think if you focused in on that intergenerational trauma and we took a more holistic approach to what we do with domestic violence perpetrators now, I think you would see not just a reduction in domestic violence figures, it would be the first substantial drop in domestic violence figures that we've had since the 1960s. Generalised rates are coming down of all crime, but that's a reflection on the police. It's not a reflection on domestic violence interventions working or anything. I appreciate most people will say, you are being very generous, but what else can we be when we look at the patterns of behaviours that they have to go through first, or they have to experience first before they get to that stage? It's just like, well, can we face the ugly truth now? Can we realise we're just dealing with broken people and find a solution, or do we have to keep going down the it's definitely men and it's definitely women route and all of that? I feel like that would be the most scientific way to approach this situation, rather than allowing the political side of things to do all the legwork. So,
well, I think that's answered one of my questions of why didn't you leave? Because you thought you could fix it, and you haven't really put any blame on her. You've excused it with her being broken, if you like.
yeah.
Can you just tell me what kind of behaviours she displayed, whether it be the physical violence or the manipulation and controlling behaviour?
Well, in terms of the manipulative behaviour, she was through the roof. So, like I say, I'm doing 728 male victims there, and there's probably only 5 cases of all the research that's there that I would say are at the same level as my ex-wife. So, she would play specifically on the fact that I have PTSD. It was undiagnosed. I was going through the diagnosis process at the time. And that's fairly usual for the veteran community. It's normally 5 years after we experience whatever that we start struggling with it all. Anyway, she took those opportunities where people would see me as being weak and struggling with my mental health to manipulate in these just most crazy situations, so that you couldn't then go out and say, look, this shit happened, because people would just go, you've got PTSD though, David. And that went on for years, and to a degree it's still going on now, and it's one of the most debilitating things in the world, because as soon as me and her separated, the isolation began for me. I stopped being able to sleep. I have extreme insomnia. I haven't been able to sleep since the 28th of October 2014. And that was the last time I was able to get any natural sleep. My cortisol levels are so high because of what we all went through, that my body is just constantly on, oh my God, what's coming next? Now, because of how it played out in front of the judiciary, in front of the police, in front of the social workers, in front of all of these authorities that were supposed to be there to help and identify when this stuff was going on and protect the children for the sake of their long-term health and well-being and short-term safety, all of those things, none of those institutions were there, really. I was lucky in the fact that I had a mental health key worker who fought very hard for me. She realised what was going on. It took the social workers 2.5 years to realise what was going on. And at the end, they all came round to my house and apologised to me for allowing it to go on that long. The police conducted a MARAC, and I got a letter out in the post saying, we have found you to be at medium to high risk of being further abused. But there was no support services there. And she was still able to, even though she was found to be the abuser, and it was quite obvious because I was turning up with the black eyes and cuts all over me and all sorts. Even though it was that obvious, she was still able to manipulate my mental health and still abuse the situation. So she, in a lot of cases, she used things like key words, like words that she had planted further at the start of the relationship, like when she described her ex, who was so incredibly violent, that when they split up, her mum chose her over her ex. That scenario I mentioned earlier. She kept using throughout the relationship, just on different occasions, she would use the words. She would always describe it exactly the same. He was so incredibly violent. And then, despite the fact that I was the one with all the cuts and bruises and things like that, once we separated, she used that terminology to describe me to the new authorities that were involved, the authorities that didn't know that I was telling the truth. So at this point, I now have all sorts of different authorities saying, oh, no, we've heard from her, we've not heard from you. But, when you go in front of those radically left-leaning feminist social workers who have spent the last 60 years denying that many male victims exist because, oh God, we can't have the hashtag patriarchy undone. It was incredibly abusive, to the point where there was one scenario where they made a load of accusations against me. I wouldn't stop denying it. They said I was so what's the word? So stressed out. They used a whole plethora of words in it. I got it in a recording and I got it on a letter as well. They basically said, we think you're having a drugs-induced psychosis and we think you should go for a stay in the hospital. Now, for anyone who knows anything about mental health interventions, if you're sent into a mental health institute for delusions, you are there for a long time under a lot of heavy drugs, and you will probably get out in 6 months to a year when you eventually admit your delusions. I refused to admit my so-called delusions. I fought them for 2 years. I was lucky that I had the support of the Shadow Minister for Social Justice and Equality here in Wales, helping me at the time. We fought off sectioning, and then it took me a further 2 years to clear my name. But my name was cleared at the end of that 2 years. The problem was all of the incredibly strong antipsychotics that they pumped me full of in that time, and the damage that it had done to my brain. So yeah, the types of things she did were through the roof. She manipulated. It wasn't just a case of manipulating certain services, as you see with what I would say is a traditional male victim of domestic violence case. There was a whole plethora of other services around as well who were also being manipulated. And when we consider what the definition of torture is, the definition of torture, the United Nations definition of torture, is to coerce somebody into making false confessions using the threat of loss of life or liberty. Well, I was certainly under a heck of a lot of pressure at that time to start saying no. I was imagining it. It's all my PTSD. And if I hadn't, or if it had gone against me, I could still be in hospital now for them demanding that I admit my delusions.
But you had scars, David. I mean, first of all, how did you get the scars? Were weapons involved, or?
Yeah, so she took a set of keys to me one day. It was a Ford Sierra key, and as I was bending down to just cover myself from it, she was going right into my back with it. So she had it between her hands, and it's a lot of people would jump in at that point and say, "Oh, it sounds like she was defending herself." Well, consider this: I was in the summer house, the back door and the front door was behind her, and she chose, instead of leaving the house, she chose to turn to me and she chose to go at me. And those were the one or two of the unfortunate times where I couldn't get away from her, where I couldn't just disappear off out of the house. In those moments, you're a bloke, you have to curl up on the ball, in a ball on the floor, and you just have to take it. You just have to wait for it to end, because if you respond, if you even restrain her, you're in trouble. The police will not see the difference. There is no grey area for them.
And even with those scars, they still thought it was you.
No, the authorities at that point were starting to realise. There was another incident where she'd thrown stuff at me during meetings. There was, in front of all of these people, there were other instances where she manipulated me and my mental health for about 3 weeks, and I kept saying to all of these different people, I'm sure she's doing this deliberately. It's breaking me psychologically. I'm sure she's doing it deliberately. And they kept saying, oh no, well, sometimes you get paranoid when you're stressed out, David, so no, I'm sure it's not that. Eventually, after 3.5 weeks, they realized, oh no, she is literally terrorizing him here. They got involved at that point, and the social workers were very good, but they'd had to be kind of encouraged to recognize me as a male victim rather than actually realizing it themselves. If he was doing to her what she's been doing to him, we would all be up in arms about it. And then I burst into tears in this meeting, and I just said, like, I can't cope with this. This has been like this for years now, 5 years. I don't understand why she's doing it. And this health visitor, this horrible lady with no training in domestic violence whatsoever, she's had the bare minimum, and it's all come from the same radically left-leaning perspective. She said, yes, but David, she was angry with you. And at that point, my mental health key worker just lost her shit, shouted at us as loud as she could, what in the hell do you think you're saying? Is it okay for David to do to her the same thing if he gets angry? And it was only when that one individual was stood around me, protecting me, that I was able to at least get some sense of, this can stop this particular episode here. This can stop now. Do you know what I mean?
And did she ever? I mean, we've discussed that she used your mental health against you. Did she ever throw that in your face, the PTSD or the autism?
Yeah, but she would constantly say things like, "No one's ever going to believe you. You're the one with PTSD, not me." So yeah, and it was so obvious as well, and that's why I went off track, didn't I? That's why I isolated myself. So veterans with PTSD, complex PTSD, tend to isolate for between 18 and 24 months. They do that 2.4 times. Now, people with complex PTSD do that generally anyway. It's just veterans are a little bit more marked on it. And when I came back from those scenarios where, I was being pumped full of drugs and she was saying all these things that weren't true, the one thing that stood out for me massively was nobody is listening. Nobody here is listening. Not one person. I was lucky that I had my mental health key worker, but yeah, there was nothing I could say or do. So I actually realised that the safest place for me to be was completely isolated. Because if anyone can walk into my life and say anything they like about me, and it becomes my reality, whether I like it or not, then I'm safer on my own. Then I can't have people around me. I can't have anyone around me. And that's when the obsessive research started in terms of what was going on. And the more and more I learned about it, you only have to look at mental health advocacy services. The fact that these services exist tell you how bad mental health patients have got it. We haven't got our own voice. Nobody is listening to us. In the vast majority of environments we walk into where there is any official status whatsoever, we have everyone else making best interest decisions for us. And, if you're a female abuser and you can see that happening to your partner, it makes it really easy to then just switch up the volume on the abuse. Because you can do whatever the hell you like and you'll get away with it. Nobody's listening to him. And this is obviously what we see in domestic violence services in general, isn't it? For male folks.
And obviously, by talking to you, I can see that it still really affects you now.
Yeah.
How long ago did the relationship end?
2000 and back end of 2014, beginning of 2015.
And yeah, it still affects you to this day.
Yeah, it haunts me, man. Haunts me. So I have probably maybe 4 or 5 nightmares a week. Some of them are completely trivial, and it's only after having it all started. Like I say, 28th of October 2014. That's when the insomnia started, and that's when I now take 200 to 300 milligram of trazodone every night just to get me to sleep. It's an incredibly strong antidepressant, and one of the side effects was that it sorts out insomnia. But yeah, the nightmares, some are really trivial. After all these years, some are really trivial, stupid stuff, but then some are very, very personal, very personal. And you wake up and your heart is just pounding out of your chest, sweat all over you. Until recently, I had an ex-military working dog here, girl called Lady. She was a high assurance search dog, IED detection. And there was one day I woke up and I just crawled to the end of the bed and I was crying. She climbed onto the mattress and she just sat down, put her arm over me and pulled me in for a cuddle. She could see how bad it was. But this is the problem. I mean, it's hard enough to be a victim of domestic violence in this day and age because there are no services, appropriate services. I mean, you can find the Adam Project in Leicestershire area. You can find Mankind Initiative, but they're only open a few hours a week. They haven't got the funding for to take on the caseload that's required in society. And last year there was over 700,000 male victims of domestic violence, and you've got 2 or 3 charities who are only open for a couple of hours a week. In terms of talking about the situation in a therapeutic environment, I can't do that. They won't let me. So this is literally the first time I've been able to speak about it since me and.
Why is that, David? Why won't you let you?
They say they're giving us a lot of different reasons. The most appropriate one, though, appears that it's an ongoing trauma, so they can't fix that because it's just going to keep going and keep going and keep going. They recognise that I'm still in a domestically abusive situation. It doesn't make sense in the fact that, I said this to them when I first came back from the whole scenario. I said, look, I need help here and I need answers. And they said, no, David, there's no point. You might as well just accept what's happened and move on. And that's a really unusual thing for a mental health team to say. They're not allowed to say it. And it took for a psychiatrist to come in and get involved and say, no, listen, this is how mental health works. If David has questions, or indeed any patient has questions that they need answers to, it's your job to help him find them. But that did almost nothing for the help. So I've had 0 therapy in 6 years. The only therapy that I've had has come from a university, Bangor University, they're a wellness centre for mindfulness and Buddhism and all that. So yeah, it's incredibly good therapy there, and a few other armed forces charities have stepped in as well. But because the vast majority of my trauma is related to that relationship, there is nothing I can do to process it. It sucks that I can. Whereas a female victim, has got women's aid to go and sit in front of all the counsellors there. There's nothing for us, so it is unprocessed trauma for the vast majority of us.
And how do you see the future then, David?
Even a few weeks ago, I was very unwell. So about 3 months ago, I tried to kill myself. It's hard. It's really hard. You don't feel like it's ever going to end. You're stuck in a situation. Somebody can reach into your world anytime, day in, day out. They can stab you with a knife, and it feels like nobody would stop. So for me, it's about the only thing I can do is try to fight this situation as much as possible, set an example. And because of the autistic side of me, because I did so much research over these last few years, I know that I can bring a scientific voice to the table that makes the experience for male victims different further down the road. And so, that's all I've got. So that's what I do. I campaign on a daily basis for fathers' rights, men's rights, children's rights. As part of my uni degree, I set up a service called the Veteran and Blue Light Service, or a charity called Families Need Fathers, Both Parents Matter Cymru. And they essentially help veterans and police members and paramedics going through the family court process, just to have a bit of emotional support and to have the legal support they need as well. We offer free legal counsel sessions where basically everyone gets online and you talk to one of our solicitors and they can help you through the process. But yeah, that's all I've got. So if my hands are tied in one respect, so in the other respect, if all I can do is fight to change this world for the better, then that's what I'll do. That's how I cope in the fight.
Well, I think that's very commendable. You're putting all your energies into that. I'd hate to think that you carried through on a suicide attempt, David. It's not worth it. Nobody's worth that.
I know, and you have to consider the after effects as well, don't you? It's a very, very hard world to live in. That I've lost through all this campaigning. I've lost from the campaigning movement and my extended circle. I know of 8 people who have died in similar circumstances. And a lot of the data that I'm going through at the moment, analysing, there is a hell of a lot of talk about suicide suicidal ideation in there as well. And it's completely, whilst you're absolutely right, there is a much better way of doing things. You can see so many out there going through exactly the same thing and expressing it exactly the same way as well. And it is this loneliness out there that, you know, there is no one they can really go to. And that's why conversations like these are so important. So that if that one person who was wondering hears any of this and thinks, shit, this is what I'm going through, man. I need to find my way to extricate myself or to change something, or this is one of my friends going through this, then, you know, fucking anything that can be done. So
I mean, through this show, I'm on my third series now, and so many men have come forward to speak to me, and this is what it's all about. It's all about giving everybody a voice. But I think more needs to be done. I think more people need to come forward and speak about it.
Yeah.
And I think more work needs to be done, such as yourself.
Yeah. This is it. The sucky thing about the situation is the research is already there. It is getting quite good now in terms of there are more and more people coming into this field who recognise nothing will get done unless we roll our sleeves up and sort this out ourselves. People like yourself. The research itself, like I say, has been there for such a long time that the resources should have been applied a long time ago as well. But you know, they absolutely haven't. We're even looking at COVID now in terms of the so-called pandemic within, or the endemic within a pandemic, whatever Women's Aid called it. What we now know is that domestic violence rates absolutely did not increase. They did for male victims substantially by about 60%. But as for female victims, there was no substantial increase. They remained relatively the same as they have always done. And yet we've seen £60 million, 60 or 70 million pound, whatever it was, going to these female-led charities, these Women's Aid-led charities, feminist charities that don't believe in male victims. And even with this massive increase in male victims, nothing has gone out to the men's charities. Absolutely nothing. And it's a shambles. It's more than just an oversight. There is a definite attempt to ignore this issue by the UK government, and they need to get their act into gear. They really, really do.
What would be your advice to male survivors of abuse going through the same things as you're going through?
Oh, Jesus. I think about this a lot. So a huge area of concern for me is fathers who are also victims of domestic violence. And I never quite know how to answer that question, because if the correct advice should be, get yourself out of that relationship and do it fast. Don't stick around, because the more violence they see coming your way, you know, the more problems the children are going to have when they grow up. You know, so it's absolutely the right thing to do to get out as fast as possible. The other side to it, though, is that we have to take into account reality. She will make excuses, accusations against you. You will go into family courts where the two social workers at the back of the room are radically left-leaning, Black Lives Matter supporting feminists who hate white cis men. Most of their essays said that while they were in university. I can assure most people of that. I've done the research in that area. I've also done social work modules. I know what they learn. But yeah, once you get into court, you're going to be in court in that scenario, and there is nothing you can do. And even if the judge sees what's happening, there will be nothing he can do. And you will end up on the pile of statistics like most of these other kids. So we say that a quarter of all children are growing up in a single parent household here in the UK. It's more than that. It's definitely more than that. But anyway, the children in those families have been through the family court in the vast majority of cases. Those children have no opportunity once you start going to family court, unless you are the lucky 1 in a million, which you won't be 9 times out of 10. You will lose access to your kids because of those political dynamics at play in court. And your abuser will be there to stick the knife in with words that mean nothing to everyone else, but there are really, really quite impactful to yourself. And it's like they're swinging across the courtroom and punching you in the face and doing it in front of the judge and everyone else, and there's nothing you can do about it. If you are lucky enough to get a contact order put in place, if she repeatedly ignores it, there will, with a high degree of likeliness, nothing will be done. They say that they can't fine her because that will be detrimental to the children, and they can't send her to jail or anything like that because that will be detrimental to the children. Therefore, yes, you're supposed to have contact with your kids, but there's nothing we can do. And those are the people that I'm worried about the most, because of male victims in general. The most at risk are those fathers who have been through hell, have made the right decision by their children, and then have not been protected by the courts, have not been protected by the judicial system. And the outcomes for those children as well are horrendous. But obviously, because they have to go through, the female perpetrators tend to be female perpetrators for several relationships. So those children will go through, that type of domestic violence experience over and over again. So it's a case of, what are you supposed to say to somebody going through that? Do you stay, take the beatings, accept that one day she might kill you? Or do you, so that you can protect the children, so that you can still see your kids? Or do you go? Do you try to do the right thing, even though you know she's probably not, and your children are still going to suffer down the line? If you're single, get out fast. You just get out, go. But if you're in a family situation, things are much more complex. And I'm so sorry that you're in that position. There are people out there like me that are trying to help, and we're setting up these services. But if anyone is listening to this and hearing what they're but find families need fathers, find mankind, find all of these little charities, little and big, and there will be people there that can help you through it, one way or the other.
That's not a rosy picture, David.
No, it's not. Unfortunately, it's the absolute truth of the situation, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, we are lucky in the respect that there are so many more people like myself, like yourself, coming out of the woodwork now, doing as much as we can to get this picture into the limelight, because the sooner we do, the sooner we can break the intergenerational trauma for the next generation. Do you know what I mean? If these kids who are exposed to these dynamics are going to be at a heightened risk of being in their own domestic violence relationships, and there's a shed load of evidence for that. And it doesn't work the way you think it does either, in terms of, well, that must turn young boys into domestic violence perpetrators. You are more, I would argue, more likely, but at least as likely, to end up a domestic violence victim if you've been exposed to it as a child as well. So
I think that's where it needs to begin, though. Do you think more education when people are young on?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The problem we have on that side of things is the feminist push to go into education and make those changes. So in the last month and a half, we had the education minister, the Conservative education minister, basically stating that as part of the high school education curriculum, boys and girls will now be taught healthy relationships from the perspective of misogyny. Oh, and we're loading the schools with social workers as well, radically left-leaning feminists, with 93% accuracy. You know what's going to come out of that? The only thing that's going to come out of that is that women are going to come out of school and university the way they have been, but much more visceral about this situation. It's definitely white men. White heterosexual men are definitely the problem. That's what will come from that. It's sickening. We need that. Everyone needs the right education, rather than a politicized education, which is what everyone's been getting for the last 60 years. If we ever want to get this right, that's exactly where we've got to go.
David, that was a lot more fascinating than even I thought it was going to be. Cool. And I thank you very much indeed for talking to me. There's a lot for everybody to take away from that and to mull over.
Yeah, I feel like I probably got it all mixed up in my head, so my apologies if I came across like I was rambling at stages. But
no, there's a lot of it. You got a lot of information out there, and it's a lot for people to think about.
Yeah.
So I'll thank you very much for that.
No problem at all. Will you send us a link and everything when it's
I'll sort that out for you, my friend.
All right,
Okay.
lovely. Okay, well, it's a pleasure talking to you, man.
Yeah, thank you very much for coming on the show.
No
Cheers.
problem. All the best. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.